Welcome to the debate. Our discussion today, it dives into the core tension presented in the analysis, Mandani's Rise, a Symptom of Systemic Decay. This piece tries to explain the sudden and really overwhelming popularity of the democratic socialist Zoran Mandani. And the source material, it sets up a pretty stark dichotomy. Mandani's success is overwhelmingly seen as a consequence of widespread structural failure, driven by economic despair and institutional decay, rather than a genuine ideological win rooted in broad socialist conviction.
It's certainly a compelling frame, yeah. But I think its power maybe comes partly from simplifying things a bit. And that's where I start to have some questions.
Right. The central question we need to grapple with is this. Does the analysis correctly prioritize economic desperation and systemic failure as the primary drivers of Mandani's support? Or does it actually substantially understate the active political agency and the appeal generated by his specific ideological and policy platforms? His democratic socialism and that particular America First foreign policy stance he has. For this discussion, I'll be defending the source's main thesis. Mandani's predominantly a reflection of societal exhaustion and failure. He's basically the political face of the chaos.
And I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle. While the systemic decay is, it's undeniable, it definitely provides the fertile ground. I'll argue the source fundamentally fails to account for the crucial role of Mandani's specific ideological alternatives and his concrete policy positions as active drivers of support. People aren't just blindly grasping in the dark here. I think they're making a specific, articulated choice for a replacement system.
Well, when we look at the evidence the source itself provides, it paints a pretty devastating picture, and one that frankly confirms Mandani as an almost inevitable reaction to collapse. The core argument is that his appeal is purely reactive, driven by, quantifiable structural collapse, leading to what the author quite accurately calls a quiet sense of exhaustion and nihilism. And we have to look at that collapse viscerally. How can we possibly separate Mandani's rise from the fact that in major cities, a simple one-bedroom apartment now costs, $4,000 to $5,000 a month? The cost of basic human survival has just become structurally impossible for huge numbers of people.
Okay, I fully agree that the affordability crisis is the essential context. From those crushing housing costs you mentioned to the simple daily inflation where, something as minor as a street hot dog has doubled or tripled in price in just a few years. That absolutely creates an environment where people are primed for change. But I don't quite buy that this level of desperation inherently cancels out ideological engagement. Actually, the sheer scale of the collapse, I think, forces people to look for complex structural answers, not just, simple relief.
But consider the depth of the chronic insecurity, which is maybe even more damaging than just high rent. The source points out that millions are buried under student debt for degrees that often don't even deliver stable employment, creating this kind of economic paralysis. And then there's medical debt, still the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in the U.S. So the author is correct, I think. People are listening to Mandani because the capitalist system failed them spectacularly. Not necessarily because they woke up one day with a deeply held positive conviction about socialist theory. It feels more like pure flight from overwhelming chronic pain. The author sums it up starkly. People who have been failed by the capitalist system will turn to socialism. It's basic human psychology. That really defines the response as a purely reactive, almost survival mode choice.
That psychological framing, basic human psychology, that's precisely where I think the source material undercuts the agency of the voter. Acknowledging the systemic failure, which, yes, the source nails by pointing out the failure of establishment figures, like those seen as corrupt and incompetent, that doesn't mean the resulting political action is just passive desperation. If the response were purely passive and reactive, wouldn't we see something like, disorganized riots? Or maybe a swing towards some authoritarian strongman promising quick fixes without any real accompanying philosophy? But Mandani has provided a clear, articulated alternative framework. His democratic socialism. It promises things like dignity, equality, and affordable living. This isn't just an emotional appeal. It's a substantive rejection of the status quo that, crucially, demands a theoretical replacement. If voters were simply desperate, they might turn to, say, someone proposing massive corporate tax cuts, hoping for some trickle-down relief, right? Instead, they're turning toward a platform proposing fundamental restructuring of ownership and capital. That shows to me a profound level of engagement.
It sounds appealing, dignity and equality, sure. But what actually delivers the votes? Is it the abstract promise of dignity, or is it the concrete reality that he promises things like canceling medical debt and implementing rent control? I'd argue the vote is driven by the immediate, measurable relief he promises. The goal is escape from financial servitude. When the author uses that powerful metaphor of citizens as zombies walking through life on survival mode, it really confirms the motivation is primal survival, not some deep ideological implementation project. I mean, the author explicitly states they don't personally support socialism, but see its rise only as a warning signal of systemic breakdown. The focus is entirely on the systemic failure, not the philosophical content of the solution being offered.
Okay, I grant you the function of Mandani's rise as a warning signal, but for any movement, even one catalyzed by chaos, to gain significant, lasting traction, the radical ideas themselves have to be coherent, appealing, and importantly, intellectually defensible in the minds of the voters. We've seen periods of massive economic upheaval before, like, say, the Great Depression, which led to structured, coherent movements like the New Deal, not just an aimless lashing out.
That's true, but the context is different.
Well, if people are turning to his platform, it's because they see a value proposition beyond just relief from pain. The pain is the motivation, yes, but the ideology provides the map. Their engagement with Mandani's quite sophisticated critique of corrupt and incompetent leadership suggests they are intellectually capable of analyzing institutional failure and choosing a conceptual alternative rather than just grabbing the nearest exit sign. Desperation opens the door, I agree, but the specific, articulated ideology dictates the direction of the political choice.
The destination, though, might just be the closest shelter. You seem to be elevating the complexity of the diagnosis, maybe above the simplicity of the cure people are actually seeking. Let's just stay on the idea of desperation for a second. When people face these impossible costs, that $4,000 rent, they're often just too exhausted to conduct complex ideological audits. They're listening because the traditional voices, the voices of capital and competence, have been silent, or worse, complicit in their suffering. The socialist label might simply be shorthand for the other thing, the anti-system solution.
That's a fair point about exhaustion, definitely. But then, what about the data that shows Mandani drawing support from demographics that are not facing immediate financial ruin? This brings us to the other elephant in the room, right? Mandani's highly controversial foreign policy stance. You suggest this is also just symptomatic. I argue it's purely ideological and structural.
Absolutely symptomatic. The source highlights Mandani going viral after publicly stating he'd prioritize helping struggling New Yorkers over making some obligatory diplomatic visit to Israel, a position that immediately contrasted him with mainstream candidates pledging fealty to foreign policy norms. And yes, it resonated profoundly.
Exactly, because it addressed fundamental structural questions about national priorities that actually transcend personal balance sheets. This America First position, it's a structural political belief that cuts across the usual political spectrum. It appeals to, say, isolationist conservatives, it appeals to anti-interventionist liberals, and critically, it appeals to a middle-class voter who might be financially secure but fundamentally rejects the existing framework of global engagement, one they perceive as prioritizing foreign spending over domestic investment. Their support isn't driven by medical debt, it's driven by a belief in national sovereignty and a rejection of perceived deference. That, by definition, seems like an active ideological choice, not just a reactive symptom of poverty.
I'm still not quite convinced by that separation, because you seem to be isolating the foreign policy sentiment from the core domestic betrayal. I would reframe Mandani's foreign policy stance as perhaps the most powerful symptom of institutional betrayal. It is effective, yes, absolutely, but it's effective because it perfectly illustrates the central domestic problem: institutional neglect.
So you're saying it's just a rhetorical tool?
It resonates precisely because it highlights the perception that the political system prioritizes external, deferential obligations, sending billions in aid, politicians feeling obligated to express loyalty to foreign states over the immediate, crippling needs of its own citizens. So, yes, in a way, it's powerful because it illustrates the moral calculus of the system's decay. When a citizen sees their political system prioritizing global deference while they themselves face bankruptcy from a common illness, Mandani's critique of foreign aid isn't some abstract foreign policy stance. It becomes an urgent domestic demand framed as a rejection of perceived negligence and misplaced priorities. The underlying driver, I still maintain, remains the failure to provide basic economic security at home.
That's a compelling way to link them, I admit. And I agree, the message is amplified by domestic pain. But let's go a bit deeper into the source's language around institutional decay.
Okay.
Regain credibility, and deliver meaningful improvement. All the evidence, housing, medical debt, inflation, points to a loss of faith in traditional mechanisms. And this fuels the narrative that Mandani's merely a necessary response to a vacuum of credibility.
Exactly. That lack of credibility is key.
That framing is crucial, but I think it leads to a certain imprecision in the source material itself. If the system simply needs to regain credibility, well, that suggests maybe minor adjustments could fix the problem, right? Better communication, maybe less corruption in City Hall, some regulatory tweaks. The implication is that voters just want better capitalism, not necessarily no capitalism.
However, Mandani's democratic socialism, it challenges the entire underlying capitalist structure. His platform isn't just about better institutions, it seems to be about replacing the economic engine altogether.
Well, the institutions are the gatekeepers.
Right, but the real pivot here is, are people angry at the politicians running the system, or are they fundamentally rejecting the engine of capitalism itself? The source tends to sort of lump institutional failure, like the perceived incompetence of certain mayors, and structural rejection, the call for socializing key industries together. But Mandani's popularity, I think, suggests a more substantive, philosophical rejection of the underlying structure, driven by the appeal of his proposed alternative.
But the failure of the institutions is what allows the radical alternative to even be heard in the first place. You absolutely need that vacuum for the message to propagate. Look, the majority of the population probably remains, at least in theory, committed to a market economy. They're turning to Mandani because the existing mechanisms, Congress, state governments, local government, have proven completely unable to solve the crippling, tangible problems of survival. If those institutions could somehow effectively deliver on housing and healthcare, the democratic socialist label would likely remain marginal.
It may be a prerequisite, I'll give you that. But the choice of democratic socialism is still an explicit choice of structure, not just a random selection from a menu of available alternatives. If the goal was simply to restore competence, wouldn't a technocratic reformer be leading the polls? Mandani is leading, I argue, because he offers both a diagnosis, capitalism is broken, and a specific cure, socialism, not just a promise to replace the incompetent people currently managing the system. The desperation is the impetus, for sure, but the ideology provides the political momentum needed for actual change.
And that momentum, I'd argue, only works because the economic instability is so profound. The sheer weight of the economic data, the chronic medical bankruptcy, the crippling student debt, the overwhelming housing costs. It proves Mandani is, as the source suggests, primarily a necessary reflection of structural failures and widespread desperation. He's a harsh mirror held up to America's current instability. His rise feels like an almost inevitable consequence of policy neglect over decades.
And I still maintain that while desperation is the essential fuel powering the engine of change, the specific policy engine itself, Mandani's particular brand of democratic socialism, combined with that nationalistic, America-first approach to foreign aid, is what transforms widespread disillusionment into a specific, identifiable political movement. The rise represents both a symptom of decay and a specific, chosen solution. And I think the source's single-minded focus on desperation dangerously undervalues that second part.
Well, the source material certainly forces us into a crucial contemplation of how political change is catalyzed. Is it by the overwhelming immediate pain of the existing system demanding urgent relief, Or is it by the compelling clarity of an ideological alternative promising a fundamentally different path forward? We seem to agree that the pain is the necessary precondition.
But the core disagreement remains, whether the ideology functions mainly as a secondary tool for organizing that desperation, or if it acts as a primary political draw in its own right.
It appears so. And that tension itself is valuable, I think, as it requires us to distinguish, within the material itself, between pure political despair and what might be a genuine, deliberate choice for a structural alternative. This analysis demands we look closely at Mandani's success not just as a failure of the current system, but perhaps as a potential blueprint for whatever might come next.